The shadows promised. She appeared from the darkness like a phantom, each painful step leaving crimson prints in the pristine snow. Her once proud frame now trembled uncontrollably, ribs visible beneath matted fur soaked through by the unforgiving storm. But it wasn't her own suffering that drove her forward. Between her jaws, carried with infinite tenderness, hung a tiny bundle of fur, barely alive, its breaths so shallow they seemed more memory than reality. The mother's amber eyes held no fear for herself, only a fierce primal determination that transcended pain and exhaustion. When she finally reached the cabin's porch, she stood motionless in the swirling blizzard, her gaze fixed on the weathered door with an almost supernatural intensity, as if she could see through wooden walls to the broken soul inside. She didn't howl. She didn't scratch. She simply waited, a sentinel in the storm, knowing with absolute certainty that behind that door waited their last chance at survival. What transpired in the hours that followed would shatter the walls around a man's heart, unearth secrets buried beneath snow and silence, and forge an unbreakable bond between three wounded spirits. This isn't merely about animals being rescued. This is the story of how they rescued him. A fortress of silence. Mason Reynolds hadn't spoken a single word in 42 days. The ancient log cabin that had been his grandfather's hunting retreat had become his fortress against the world, tucked away in Montana's remote Bitterroot Range, where the nearest neighbor was 7 miles away. The isolation wasn't accidental. It was carefully cultivated, a punishment he designed for himself. Inside, the cabin told the story of a life interrupted. Half-empty coffee mugs gathered dust on end tables. Unopened mail formed small mountains on the kitchen counter. A wall calendar remained frozen on March 17th, as if time itself had stopped moving forward on that particular Tuesday. Mason sat motionless in his grandfather's recliner, watching shadows from the dying fire dance across the cedar walls. Each crackle and pop from the hearth only emphasized the smothering silence that had become his constant companion. The whiskey bottle at his feet, his third this week, was nearly empty, but the numbness he sought remained frustratingly out of reach. The memories still cut with surgical precision. The hospital's antiseptic smell, the doctor's practiced sympathy, the impossible weight of signing papers that allowed them to turn off life support. The funeral where he stood like a statue while everyone told him how sorry they were about Sarah and little Emma. His paramedic badge and credentials, now locked in a drawer he couldn't bring himself to open. Outside, the storm had intensified, wind howling like a living thing trying to force its way inside. Mason barely noticed. He'd become accustomed to the cabin's winter soundtrack, the creaking timbers, the persistent draft that whistled through the gap beneath the kitchen window, the occasional thump of snow falling from overloaded branches, which is why the silence that suddenly fell made his skin prickle. The wind hadn't stopped, the storm hadn't passed, but something had changed in the atmosphere, like the pause between heartbeats stretched beyond its natural limit. Mason stood, muscles protesting after hours of immobility. He moved to the window, wiping condensation from the glass with his palm. At first, he saw nothing but darkness and swirling white. Then a shape materialized from the chaos. A large dog standing perfectly still on his porch, staring directly at the door with an almost human intensity. A German shepherd, her dark fur nearly invisible against the night, except where the porch light caught her eyes, turning them to amber flames. Mason blinked, certain his isolation had finally progressed to hallucinations. But the dog remained, and as his eyes adjusted, he noticed something in her mouth, something small and limp, something dying. He wasn't sure what propelled him to the door. Maybe it was professional instinct, the paramedic in him responding to an emergency despite years of rust. Maybe it was simply that the dog's unwavering gaze somehow penetrated the fortress he'd built around himself. The cold hit him like a physical blow when he opened the door, wind whipping snow around his ankles and into the cabin. The German shepherd didn't move, didn't react beyond a slight tensing of her muscles. She simply stood, eyes locked with his, holding her precious cargo with infinite care. A puppy, barely bigger than Mason's hand. Its fur was matted with blood and ice, tiny body trembling with each shallow breath. "Jesus Christ," Mason whispered, his voice rough from disuse. The shepherd took one tentative step forward, then stopped, as if asking permission. There was no collar, no sign of ownership beyond the unmistakable bond between mother and child. Her eyes never left Mason's face, communicating more clearly than words. "Help us, please." He should close the door. He should call animal control or the ranger station. He should protect himself from whatever complications these animals would bring. Instead, Mason crouched down slowly, extending his hand palm up. "Come on, then," he said, the words scraping his throat. "Let's get you both out of the cold." The shepherd hesitated only a moment before limping forward, her entire body communicating exhaustion and pain. She moved with the careful determination of a soldier completing one final mission. Once inside, she gently laid the puppy on the rug before the fireplace, then collapsed beside it, sides heaving with effort. She nudged the tiny form with her nose, a whimper escaping that seemed to contain all the worry and love a mother could possess. Mason knelt beside them, assessing injuries with hands that remembered their purpose. The puppy was male, maybe 4 weeks old, hypothermic and severely dehydrated. The mother had lacerations on her paws and legs, her left rear leg swollen at the joint. As he moved to examine the puppy more carefully, the shepherd's eyes tracked his every movement. Not aggressive, not threatening, watchful, evaluating, trusting, but conditionally. Something in his voice must have convinced her. She laid her head down, still pressed protectively against her pup, but allowed Mason to gently lift the tiny body. The firelight revealed more than just injuries. It illuminated a face hollowed by grief, eyes that hadn't truly seen anything in months, suddenly focused with painful clarity. It showed hands that had once saved countless lives, now trembling as they touched a small, failing heartbeat. And in that moment, as the storm raged outside and 3 broken souls huddled in the firelight, something shifted in the atmosphere of the silent cabin. Not healing, not yet, but perhaps the first fragile possibility that healing might someday come. Embers in the dark, the kitchen table became an emergency room. Mason cleared it with one sweep of his arm, sending unwashed dishes and unopened mail crashing to the floor. He laid the puppy on a clean towel, mind automatically categorizing symptoms and priorities, with a clarity that felt foreign after months of fog. Hypothermia first, then dehydration, then assess for other injuries. The mother watched from a few feet away, hackles slightly raised, muscles coiled in readiness. She wasn't aggressive, just poised to intervene should Mason prove unworthy of her desperate trust. "You found the right house," Mason told her as he worked, voice still rough from disuse. "I used to be good at this, saving things." His hands moved methodically, wrapping the puppy in warm towels, massaging circulation back into limbs cold as stone. The tiny creature made no sound, gave no resistance, just the faintest rise and fall of his chest to indicate life still clung to his small frame. "He needs a name," Mason murmured, more to fill the silence than anything else. He studied the puppy's markings, mostly black like his mother, but with a patch of reddish-brown fur on his chest. "Ember," he decided, "because there's still a spark in you. Isn't there, buddy?" The mother's ears twitched at his voice. She inched closer, eyes never leaving her pup. "And you?" Mason considered the shepherd's dark fur, her silent vigilance, the way she had materialized from the storm like a specter. "Shadow. That fits you." Outside, the storm intensified, wind howling against the windows with renewed fury. The power flickered once, twice, then died completely, leaving only the fireplace casting warm light across the cabin's interior. Mason didn't flinch. He'd been living half in darkness for months anyway. He prepared a mixture of warm water, salt, and sugar, a makeshift rehydration solution, and began the painstaking process of administering drops into Ember's mouth with a plastic syringe from his old field kit. Each tiny swallow was a victory. Each tiny swallow was a victory. Shadow finally settled at the edge of the table, close enough to see but giving Mason space to work. Her intelligent eyes missed nothing. It struck Mason suddenly how the cabin felt different, not just because of the newcomers, but because something in him had changed. The lethargy that had weighted his limbs for months had lifted. His mind was clear, focused, his hands steady. He was needed again. Hours passed in a strange, timeless bubble. Outside, Montana winter raged. Inside, the battle for Ember's life continued in small, measured victories. A stronger heartbeat, warmer paws, the first tiny whimper. When the puppy finally opened his eyes, dark brown, unfocused but undeniably alive, Mason felt something crack in his chest, something he'd thought permanently sealed. "That's it, Ember," he whispered. "Stay with us." Around 3 a.m., exhaustion finally claimed Mason. He settled into the recliner, Ember wrapped in blankets on his chest, monitored by touch even in sleep. Shadow curled at his feet, not fully relaxed, but allowing herself rest. For the first time in 42 nights, Mason Reynolds slept without dreaming of sirens and shattered glass. He woke to silence and weak winter light filtering through frosted windows. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by pristine white. For a disorienting moment, Mason thought he'd dreamed the entire episode, until he felt the warm weight on his chest and saw Shadow's amber eyes watching him from the floor. Ember was noticeably stronger, squirming slightly in his blanket cocoon. His tiny pink tongue darted out, seeking nourishment. Shadow immediately stood, ears forward, clearly responding to her pup's needs. "Hungry, huh? Hungry?" Mason carefully unwrapped Ember, checking vitals with practiced motions. Temperature improved. Hydration improving. "Let's see if we can find something for both of you." The problem of feeding them became Mason's focus. The cabin's pantry contained human food, not dog supplies. He found canned chicken, warming it with some rice, mashing a portion for Ember. Shadow watched the preparation with intense concentration, her posture communicating both hunger and restraint. When Mason finally set down 2 bowls, Shadow didn't immediately eat. Instead, she nudged the smaller bowl, checking her puppy's food first, before starting on her own with controlled desperation. Mason watched them, something like wonder creeping through him. "You're a good mom," he told Shadow quietly. "Better than most people." After breakfast, Mason finally addressed Shadow's injuries, cleaning the cuts on her paws and examining the swollen leg. No breaks, likely just a sprain. She allowed his ministrations with stoic patience, only growling once when his examination caused particular pain. "Sorry, girl," he murmured. Almost done. When he finished, Shadow gave his hand a single quick lick, acknowledgement of care given and received. The simple gesture nearly undid him. With immediate medical needs addressed, Mason's thoughts turned to broader questions. Where had they come from? Shadow clearly wasn't a stray. Her behavior was too socialized, her response to commands too immediate, and her desperate journey through the blizzard hadn't been random. She had been running from something, or someone. Mason moved to the window, surveying the transformed landscape. Fresh snow had erased all tracks, all evidence of their arrival path. Shadow joined him, her posture changing subtly, head low, ears alert. muscles tense. She stared into the white expanse with unmistakable vigilance. Not just vigilance, Mason realized. Fear. The realization settled like ice in his stomach. Shadow wasn't just lost, she was hiding. And whatever she was hiding from might still be out there. Tracks in the snow by noon. Ember had progressed from critical to stable. He took milk warmed with a little honey from an eyedropper, his tiny body gaining strength by the hour. Shadow rarely left his side, though her attention frequently shifted to the windows, ears swiveling to catch sounds beyond human perception. Mason watched her behavior with growing concern. Years as a first responder had taught him to read body language, to recognize trauma responses. Shadow displayed classic hypervigilance, the constant scanning, the tension that returned whenever sounds broke the silence, the positioning that always kept both exits in view. She wasn't just a stray. She wasn't just a stray. She was a survivor. Once he was confident Ember could rest safely, Mason pulled on his heavy winter gear. "I'll be right back," he told Shadow, who watched him with evident suspicion. "Just checking the perimeter." The cold hit him like a physical blow when he stepped outside. The storm had left behind nearly 2 feet of fresh snow and bitter temperatures that made his lungs ache with each breath. The world had been transformed into something pristine and silent. The landscape simplified to essential contrasts of white snow, dark trees, and blue sky. Mason circled the cabin slowly, scanning for any indication of Shadow's arrival path. The north side, somewhat sheltered from the wind, revealed faint depressions, ghostly suggestions of tracks partially filled by the storm's final hours. He followed them cautiously, moving between towering pines that groaned under their snow burden. About a quarter-mile into the forest, a fallen tree created a natural shelter where the snow wasn't quite as deep. Mason might have missed it entirely if not for a flash of color against the white, something distinctly man-made. He approached carefully, crouching to examine what appeared to be scraps of tattered nylon, a dog collar, partially buried and frozen to the ground. He pried it loose, turning it over in his gloved hands. No tags, but the inside surface bore something that made his blood run cold. A small metal stud with 3 raised letters, DK. The collar wasn't worn through or damaged. It had been deliberately cut, the edges frayed, where Shadow had apparently chewed through the remaining section to free herself completely. Mason pocketed the collar fragment and continued searching. Beneath the fallen tree, more evidence emerged. A torn piece of what might have been a tarp, boot prints now almost completely filled with snow, and most disturbing dark stains that could only be blood frozen into the bark. His instincts sharpened. This wasn't just about a stray dog and her puppy. He was looking at the aftermath of something deliberate, something violent. Mason followed the faint trail further, moving slowly to avoid missing crucial details. 100 yards deeper into the forest, the trees opened into a small clearing where the remnants of a campsite were barely visible beneath the snow. A fire pit now cold and buried, a flattened area where a tent might have stood, and half concealed by a drift, a metal cage. The sight hit Mason like a physical blow. The cage was barely large enough for a medium-sized dog to stand in, its metal floor crusted with frozen waste and blood. Beside it lay a battery-powered device Mason recognized with sickening clarity. A cattle prod, modified with a smaller end. Mason's mind flashed to the strange circular mark he'd noticed on Ember's hindquarters during examination. Too perfect to be accidental, too deliberate to be anything but a brand. He photographed everything with his phone, then gathered what evidence he could. The prod, a discarded food wrapper with a partial receipt, the cage's padlock which had been broken, presumably during Shadow's escape. When he returned to the cabin, Mason found Shadow standing guard at the door, her posture communicating both relief and continued wariness. She sniffed his clothes thoroughly, growling softly when she detected scents from the campsite. "I know, girl," Mason said quietly, kneeling to her level. "I found where you came from, but they're not getting you back, either of you." That night, as Ember slept peacefully by the fire and Shadow finally allowed herself deeper rest, Mason sat at his dust-covered desk and powered up his laptop for the first time in months. The satellite internet connection was slow but functional, allowing him to search for information on dog breeding operations, animal trafficking, and the significance of the DCK marking. What he found turned his stomach. Reports from across 3 states described an underground network that acquired, bred, and sold dogs for various illegal purposes: fighting, breeding, experimentation. The operations moved frequently to avoid detection, using remote wilderness areas as temporary bases. Several busts had occurred over the past year, but authorities believed multiple cells remained active. The most recent report described dogs rescued with circular brands, marks used to identify particularly valuable bloodlines. Mason looked over at Shadow, understanding now why she had risked everything to escape. Not just for herself, but for her puppy, to prevent Ember from being raised in that system of cruelty and exploitation. He was composing an email to the Regional Fish and Wildlife Office when Shadow suddenly stood, hackles raised, a low growl building in her throat. Mason froze, listening intently. At first he heard nothing beyond the normal night sounds of the forest. Then, almost imperceptible, the crunch of boots on snow. Somewhere near the shed, someone had found them. The Guardian's Choice Mason moved silently across the cabin, dimming the kerosene lamp until only the fireplace provided light. Shadow stood rigid, her attention fixed on the back door, teeth slightly bared. In the nest of blankets, Ember slept on, oblivious to the danger. "Stay," Mason whispered to Shadow, touching her head lightly. To his surprise, she obeyed, though every muscle in her body vibrated with the desire to attack. He retrieved his grandfather's hunting rifle from the cabinet, checking that it was loaded before moving to the window. Moonlight transformed the snow-covered clearing into a silver landscape, shadows sharp and defined against the white. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just the shed, the woodpile, the truck covered in snow. Then movement caught his eye. A dark figure moving with practiced stealth along the tree line. Not random movement, purposeful, searching. The figure paused at the shed, trying the door, then circling toward the back of the cabin. Mason's heart pounded, but his hands remained steady. Years of emergency response had trained his body to function under stress. He moved to the back door, positioning himself to the side, waiting. The footsteps stopped just outside. A pause, then a soft knock. 3 measured taps that seemed calculated to appear non-threatening. Mason remained silent. "Hello?" A male voice called, casual and friendly. "Sorry to bother you so late. My name's Vince Mercer. Animal Control. Got a report about some dogs in the area. Wonder if I could have a word." The practiced ease of the lie made Mason's skin crawl. No legitimate official would approach an isolated cabin at night, alone during winter. And no report could have been filed, not when Shadow had appeared during a blizzard with no witnesses. Mason caught Shadow's eye, signaling her to remain still. She complied, though her entire body trembled with restraint. "I know someone's home," the voice continued, a harder edge creeping in. "Lights were on earlier. Look, I just need to know if you've seen a German Shepherd, female, with a pup." "They're research animals, valuable. There's a reward." Mason took a deep breath, then spoke loudly enough to be heard through the door. "No dogs here, just me. And I don't appreciate visitors at this hour." A pause. Mind if I take a quick look around? Won't take but a minute. I mind very much, Mason replied. This is private property. Another pause, longer this time. Mason could almost feel the calculations happening on the other side of the door. Fair enough, the voice finally responded. False cheer returning. Sorry to disturb you. If you do see anything, there's a number on the notice board at the ranger station. Good reward for information. Footsteps crunched away from the door, but Mason wasn't fooled. He remained in position, rifle ready, watching through the window as the figure appeared to retreat toward the trees. The moment the man disappeared from view, Shadow's growl deepened, her attention shifting to the side of the cabin. Mason understood immediately. The visitor wasn't leaving. He was circling, moving quickly but quietly. Mason positioned himself at another window in time to see the dark figure approaching the woodpile, where a tarp-covered stack of firewood created a blind spot visible only from this angle. For a moment, moonlight illuminated the man's face, narrow, clean-shaven, utterly ordinary except for the cold calculation in his eyes. He carried something in his right hand that glinted metallically in the moonlight. Without hesitation, Mason threw open the window and leveled the rifle. That's far enough, he called, voice ringing with authority. Next step you take will be your last. The man froze, then slowly raised his hands. The metal object, a handheld tracker of some kind, still clutched in one. Easy now, he said, voice controlled despite the situation. Just doing my job. Your job doesn't bring you to my property at night with a tracker and a fake badge, Mason replied. I found your campsite. I know what you're doing. Something flickered across the man's face. Surprise, then a colder calculation. You don't understand what you're getting involved in, he said. Those animals are property, expensive property. People above my pay grade want them back. They're not property, Mason said, rifle unwavering. And they're not going back. The man's expression hardened. You live out here alone. No neighbors, no witnesses. Is this really how you want things to go? The threat hung in the frigid air between them. For a heartbeat, Mason saw another winter night, another life-or-death moment when he'd failed to protect what mattered. The memory threatened to paralyze him. Then Shadow appeared beside him, silent and watchful, her presence anchoring him to the present moment. This time would be different. This time, he wouldn't fail. Last warning, Mason said quietly. Get off my property now or I start shooting. Something in his voice, the absolute certainty perhaps, finally penetrated the man's confidence. He lowered his hands slowly, backing away step by step. Eyes never leaving the rifle. This isn't over, he said. They'll send more than me next time. I'm counting on it, Mason replied. He watched until the figure disappeared into the trees, then quickly moved through the cabin, securing doors and windows. Shadow followed him on his rounds, her vigilance matching his own. When they'd checked every entrance, Mason knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. We need to be ready, he told her. But we won't face them alone. That night, Mason sent emails to every law enforcement and wildlife protection agency in the region, attaching photos of the evidence he'd gathered and detailed descriptions of the encounter. He activated old connections from his paramedic days, calling in favors from people who owed him. As dawn approached, he sat beside the fire, Shadow's head resting on his knee. Ember curled against her side. The cabin no longer felt like a fortress against the world, but a bastion to be defended, not just for his sake, but for theirs. For the first time in almost a year, Mason Reynolds had a purpose again. He'd failed to protect his family once. He wouldn't fail Shadow and Ember. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The storm returns 3 days, passed in a heightened state of vigilance. Mason reinforced the cabin's vulnerabilities, boarding weaker windows, setting up motion-activated lights, creating defensive positions, all while continuing to nurse Ember back to health and helping Shadow recover from her injuries. The puppy grew stronger by the hour, his personality emerging in small, delightful ways. The determined wiggle when he spotted food, the tiny yips during sleep, the way he curled perfectly into Mason's palm. Shadow's transformation was equally remarkable. Though still hypervigilant, she began to display moments of genuine trust, sleeping more deeply, accepting affection without flinching, even wagging her tail when Mason spoke to her. On the fourth morning, Mason woke to Shadow standing rigid beside his bed, a low growl rumbling in her chest. Outside, the weather had shifted again. Dark clouds gathering on the horizon, wind picking up with the promise of another storm. But it wasn't the weather that had alarmed Shadow. A vehicle was approaching, the distinctive sound of an engine laboring up the snow-covered access road. Mason dressed quickly, checked that the rifle was loaded, and moved to the front window. Through the trees, he caught glimpses of a dark SUV making slow progress toward the cabin. No markings, tinted windows, not rangers or local police. Shadow's growl deepened. She moved to stand protectively over Ember, who had begun to explore short distances from his blanket nest. "It's okay," Mason told her, though he felt anything but certain. "We're prepared." He positioned himself by the door, rifle ready but not visible, and waited as the vehicle finally pulled into the clearing and stopped. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, the driver's door opened, and a woman stepped out, tall, athletic build, dark hair pulled back severely, wearing a heavy winter coat that couldn't quite disguise the professional suit beneath. She surveyed the cabin with sharp eyes, then moved to the passenger side and opened the door. Another figure emerged, a man older with the unmistakable bearing of law enforcement, despite his civilian clothes. Mason watched them approach the cabin, their movements cautious but not furtive. Not like the night visitor. Still, he kept the rifle close as they reached the porch. The woman knocked firmly. "Mr. Reynolds," she called. Mason Reynolds? The use of his name, his real name, sent a jolt through Mason. Few people knew where he'd gone after leaving Sacramento. "Who's asking?" he responded, not opening the door. "Detective Isabella Ramirez, Special Investigations Unit," the woman replied. "And this is Agent Thomas Blackwood, Federal Wildlife Service. We received your information about the dog trafficking operation. We'd like to talk." Mason hesitated. The credentials sounded legitimate, but so had the night visitor's claim of animal control authority. "Show me ID," he said. "Hold them up to the window." Without protest, both visitors produced identification cards and held them toward the nearest window. Mason examined them carefully. Official seals, proper formatting, photos that matched the faces. Still cautious, he cracked the door open, rifle now visible. "What do you want to know?" Detective Ramirez's eyes flickered to the weapon, then back to Mason's face. "We've been tracking this operation for 8 months, she said. 3 states, multiple sites. Your information could help us shut down the entire network, not just a local cell." Mason studied her expression, looking for deception. He found only professional intensity and something else, personal investment. "You have 2 minutes to convince me you're who you say you are," he told them. Ramirez nodded. "The operation uses the initials Diamond Creek Kennels. It's a front for breeding and training dogs for illegal fighting rings and private collectors who want specialized animals. They identify valuable bloodlines with circular brands." Her eyes hardened. "They've been particularly interested in German Shepherds with specific characteristics: intelligence, trainability, protective instincts." The details matched what Mason had discovered. Still, he hesitated. "And I should trust you because I was undercover in their organization for 4 months, she replied, her voice taking on an edge, "until I was compromised and nearly killed. This is personal for me, Mr. Reynolds." She unbuttoned her coat and pulled down the collar of her sweater, revealing a circular scar at the base of her neck, identical to the mark on Ember's flank. They brand their property, she said quietly, including people who get too close. Mason lowered the rifle slightly. "Come in," he said, but slowly. As the visitors entered, Shadow tensed, positioning herself between them and Ember. Mason respected her judgment, keeping a careful distance between the newcomers and the dog. "You have her," Blackwood said, eyes widening at the sight of Shadow. "Subject 17. She disappeared during our raid on their temporary camp 3 days ago. We found evidence of multiple animals, but she was the only one unaccounted for." "Subject 17?" Mason repeated, disgust evident. "Their designation, not ours," Ramirez clarified. "She was one of their most valuable breeding females. Pure German shepherd with exceptional intelligence and protective capabilities. She escaped during the raid. We assumed she'd been killed or recaptured. Her name is Shadow," Mason said firmly, "and she found me during the blizzard. Carried her puppy through the storm." Ramirez exchanged a glance with Blackwood. "That tracks with her history. Her last litter was born approximately 4 weeks ago. The organization typically separates mothers from pups at that stage to begin specialized training." "Training?" Mason asked, though he suspected the answer. "Conditioning," Blackwood said grimly, "using punishment and reward to create specific behaviors. The mothers are particularly valuable, both for breeding and for demonstrating protective behaviors they want to reinforce in the offspring." Mason looked at Shadow, understanding now the depth of her trauma and the miracle of her trust. "She won't go back," he said, voice firm. "Neither of them will. That's not why we're here," Ramirez assured him. "We want to shut down the entire operation. The man who came to your cabin 3 nights ago, we believe he's a local handler named Vincent Mercer, mid-level in the organization, but connected to the leadership. He threatened to come back with more people," Mason said. Ramirez nodded, and he meant it. "These people don't give up valuable assets easily, but his visit gives us an opportunity. If he returns, we can track him back to their current base." "Using us as bait," Mason concluded. "Using their own greed against them," Blackwood corrected. "With your permission, we'd like to set up surveillance equipment around your property. When they return, and they will, we'll be ready." Mason considered this, looking from the agents to Shadow and Ember. The puppy had emerged from his blankets, curious about the newcomers, but staying close to his mother. Shadow remained tense but watchful, her intelligence evident as she assessed the situation. "If I agree to this," Mason said slowly, "I want guarantees. Shadow and Ember stay with me regardless of the outcome. No evidence claims, no bureaucratic red tape." Ramirez studied him for a long moment. "You were a paramedic," she said. "Sacramento County, specialized in trauma response. Left after a personal tragedy. You understand what we're fighting against here." The direct reference to his past stung, but Mason didn't flinch. "I understand better than most." "Then you know why this matters," she continued. "These animals aren't just being mistreated, they're being weaponized, turned into tools for illegal activities that hurt more people and animals." Mason knelt beside Shadow, placing a hand gently on her back. She leaned into his touch almost imperceptibly. "We'll help," he said finally. "But they stay with me. That's non-negotiable." Ramirez nodded. "I'll make it happen." Over the next several hours, Mason worked with the agents to prepare the cabin and surrounding area. Surveillance equipment was installed at key points in the forest. Communication systems were established. Contingency plans discussed. Through it all, Shadow watched with evident understanding, as if comprehending that these preparations were connected to her past and future. She allowed Ramirez to approach only after extensive observation, and even then maintained a protective distance between the agent and Ember. As evening approached, bringing with it the first flurries of the approaching storm, Ramirez and Blackwood prepared to leave. "We'll have teams positioned within response range by nightfall," Blackwood explained. Everything is in place. Now we wait. They'll come tonight, Ramirez said with certainty. The storm provides cover, and they know you're alone. Mason nodded, the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. We'll be ready. After the agents departed, Mason secured the cabin and sat before the fire, checking the rifle one final time. Shadow settled beside him, her head on his knee, eyes reflecting the dancing flames. You found me for a reason, he told her quietly. I don't know if it was instinct or luck or something else entirely, but I promise you this, they won't take you back. Not while I'm breathing. Shadow's eyes met his, communicating a depth of understanding that transcended language. In that silent exchange was a bond forged through shared trauma and mutual protection. A promise that went both ways. Outside, the storm intensified, snow beginning to fall in earnest. The wind rose to a howl, wrapping the cabin in a blanket of white noise that would mask the approach of anyone, friend or foe. Mason stroked Shadow's head gently. Rest while you can, he murmured. It's going to be a long night. It's going to be a long night. The final stand, darkness fell completely by 6 o'clock, the storm transforming the forest into an impenetrable wall of swirling white. The temperature plummeted, wind finding every crack and crevice in the cabin's aged structure. Mason had positioned himself in the recliner with clear sight lines to both doors, the rifle across his lap, a battery-powered radio beside him, tuned to the frequency Ramirez had provided. Shadow refused to rest. She moved between windows, checking each entry point with military precision, her body language shifting between alertness and tension. Ember, sensing the atmosphere, remained unusually quiet in his nest by the fire, dark eyes following his mother's movements. By 8, the waiting had become its own form of torture. Mason found himself replaying the encounter with Mercer, analyzing every word, every threat, wondering if the agent's confidence was misplaced, wondering if he'd made the right decision. Then Shadow froze, ears forward, body rigid. A growl built in her throat, not loud but deep and unmistakable. Mason raised the radio. Movement, he whispered. Static, then Ramirez's voice, barely audible. Northeast perimeter. 3 figures, armed. Mason's mouth went dry. Despite the preparations, the reality of armed intruders approaching his home sent adrenaline coursing through him. He positioned himself away from windows, gesturing for Shadow to join him in the protected corner where Ember lay. Surprisingly, she obeyed, curling her body around her puppy while maintaining vigilant watch on the doors. Minutes stretched with excruciating slowness. Mason could hear nothing beyond the howling wind, see nothing beyond the occasional flicker of motion-activated lights through snow-covered windows. Then suddenly, a different sound cut through the storm, the distinctive crack of a gunshot, followed by shouting. The radio crackled to life. Suspects engaged at northeast corner, came Blackwood's voice, tight with tension. 2 officers in pursuit. 3rd suspect heading toward cabin. Repeat, 1 heading toward cabin. Mason's grip tightened on the rifle. The plan had been to capture all suspects away from the cabin, to avoid direct confrontation. Something had gone wrong. Shadow's growl deepened, her attention fixed on the back door with laser intensity. Mason moved into position, using the kitchen counter as cover, rifle trained on the entrance. The door burst open with stunning force, hinges partially giving way as a figure stumbled inside. Mercer, soaked, panting, wild-eyed, a pistol clutched in his gloved hand. His gaze locked on Mason, then shifted to Shadow and Ember in the corner. Something like rage mixed with desperation twisted his features. You, he snarled. You cost me everything. Mason kept the rifle steady. Drop the gun. It's over. Law enforcement has your associates. Mercer laughed. a harsh sound without humor. You think I care about them? Do you have any idea what these animals are worth? What people pay for breeding rights? His eyes narrowed, calculating even in extremity. I can still salvage this. The female and pup. One shot, and you're out of the picture. He raised his weapon, but before he could aim, Shadow launched herself across the room. A dark missile of fur and fury, teeth bared, hitting Mercer with enough force to slam him against the wall. The pistol discharged into the ceiling as man and dog crashed to the floor. Shadow's jaws clamped around Mercer's wrist, drawing a scream of pain and forcing him to release the weapon. Mason moved instantly, kicking the pistol away and leveling the rifle at Mercer's head. "Don't move," he ordered, voice deadly calm. Shadow maintained her hold, blood seeping between her teeth where they punctured Mercer's sleeve. Her eyes never left his face, centuries of protective instinct focused into a single, unwavering purpose. The back door crashed open again as Ramirez and two tactical officers entered, weapons drawn. Weapons drawn. Federal agents, Ramirez shouted. "Hands where we can see them." Mercer, pinned by Shadow's weight and immobilized by her grip, could only comply with his free hand. "Get this fucking animal off me!" he gasped. "Shadow!" Mason called softly. "Release." For a moment she didn't respond, primal fury still driving her. Then slowly her jaws unclenched. She backed away from Mercer, returning immediately to Ember's side, body still vibrating with protective energy. As the officers secured Mercer, Ramirez approached Mason. "You two okay?" Mason nodded, the adrenaline beginning to ebb. "We're fine. Did you get the others?" "Both in custody," she confirmed. "And based on the equipment we found in their vehicle, we have enough evidence to connect them to at least 4 other sites in Montana and Idaho." She glanced at Shadow with newfound respect. "That's one remarkable dog." "She is," Mason agreed quietly. After Mercer had been removed and the cabin secured, Ramirez returned with Blackwood. "The operation was successful beyond our expectations," the agent explained. "Mercer's phone contains contacts, locations, financial details, everything we need to dismantle the entire network." "And Shadow?" Mason asked. "Ember?" Ramirez smiled slightly. "As promised, they stay with you. Officially, they're being placed in protective custody with a qualified caretaker." She handed him a folder. "Adoption paperwork, medical records we recovered from their files, everything you need to make it permanent." Mason accepted the folder with a strange tightness in his chest. "Thank you." After the agents departed, promising to return the next day to remove their equipment, Mason found himself alone again with Shadow and Ember. The cabin, which hours before had been a battlefield, slowly returned to its natural state, a sanctuary, but one transformed by the events that had unfolded within its walls. He sat beside the fire, exhaustion finally catching up to him. Shadow approached, resting her head on his knee in what had become their familiar position of mutual comfort. Ember, growing braver by the day, wobbled over to join them, climbing awkwardly into Mason's lap with determined little grunts. Mason stroked them both, feeling the weight of the past gradually lifting from his shoulders. "Well," he said softly, "I guess we're a family now." Shadow's eyes met his, filled with an intelligence, an understanding that needed no words. In her gaze was not just the traumatic past they had survived together, but something more precious, the promise of days to come. Healing together, spring came to the Montana wilderness like a slow awakening. Snow retreated inch by inch, revealing ground that had lain dormant through the long winter. The forest filled with tentative birdsong, then grew bolder as temperatures rose and green returned to the landscape. The cabin changed too, no longer a tomb of memories, but a home alive with movement and purpose. The drawn curtains were pulled back to admit sunlight. The empty rooms filled with new sounds, the click of paws on hardwood, the jingle of collar tags, occasional barks and yips that punctuated the day's rhythm. Ember had grown from a fragile bundle of fur into a gangly, energetic puppy whose boundless curiosity and joy were matched only by his appetite. He explored every corner of the cabin and its surrounding yard, venturing further each day under the watchful eyes of both Shadow and Mason. Shadow's transformation had been equally remarkable. The hypervigilant, traumatized survivor had gradually relaxed into a confident, affectionate companion who maintained her protective instincts without the edge of constant fear. She still patrolled the perimeter each morning and evening, old habits ingrained too deeply to abandon completely. But now she did so with calm assurance, rather than desperate anxiety. The most profound changes, however, had occurred in Mason himself. The paramedic who had retreated from the world, convinced he had nothing left to offer, had found new purpose in the daily care of his canine family. The discipline required to train Shadow and Ember, the routine of feeding and exercise, the simple necessity of being present for someone else's needs, all had pulled him back into life one day at a time. 6 months after that fateful night in the blizzard, Mason sat on the cabin's porch, watching Shadow and Ember play in the clearing. The German Shepherd had developed a game of hide-and-seek, disappearing behind trees only to emerge when Ember's searching grew too frantic, teaching patience and tracking skills through instinct and example. Detective Ramirez's truck appeared on the access road, now clear of snow, and significantly improved by the gravel Mason had laid down over several weekends. She visited periodically with updates on the case, and to check on Shadow and Ember, though Mason suspected her continued interest went beyond professional obligation. She climbed from the vehicle smiling as Ember abandoned his game to race toward her, tail wagging frantically. Shadow followed at a more dignified pace, greeting the detective with a nudge of her nose against Ramirez's hand, a sign of acceptance that had been hard-won over many visits. "They look good," Ramirez observed, joining Mason on the porch steps. "Happy. They are," Mason agreed. "Most days anyway. Shadow still has nightmares sometimes. I can tell by the way she paces at night, but they're less frequent now." Ramirez nodded in understanding. "Trauma leaves marks that don't fade completely, but they can become part of the landscape rather than defining it." Mason glanced at her, recognizing the personal knowledge behind the observation. "How's the case progressing?" "Better than we hoped," she replied. 37 arrests across 5 states. Hundreds of animals rescued and placed with shelters or qualified homes. She paused. "The trial for the leadership begins next month. They've asked if you would testify about finding Shadow and Ember." Mason considered this, watching as Shadow guided Ember back to their game with gentle nudges. "Will it help?" "Yes," Ramirez said simply. "Your testimony connects the physical evidence to the victims in a way that statistics and photographs can't achieve." "Then I'll do it," Mason decided. "For them, for the others." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the afternoon sun warming the porch as Shadow and Ember continued their play in the clearing. "I've been thinking," Mason said eventually, "about going back to work." Ramirez raised an eyebrow, surprised but pleased. "Paramedic?" "Something different," he replied. "The Wildlife Service has an opening for a rescue specialist in this region. Emergency medical response for injured animals, coordination with rehabilitation centers." He gestured toward Shadow and Ember. "They made me remember what it feels like to save something, to make a difference." "You'd be good at that," Ramirez said, genuine approval in her voice. Mason nodded, still processing the decision himself. "I think so too, and I could do it from here, keep this place as home base." He smiled slightly. "They need space to run. They need space to run." As if hearing his words, Shadow and Ember raced past the porch, engaged in an elaborate game of chase that involved increasingly acrobatic maneuvers around trees and bushes. Their joy was infectious, pulling a laugh from Mason that felt rusty but genuine. "You know," Ramirez said thoughtfully, "when we first met, I wondered if you'd be able to handle this. Not just the immediate threat, but the long-term commitment to animals with their kind of history." "And now?" Mason asked. She smiled. "Now I think they're exactly where they belong, with someone who understands what it means to rebuild after everything falls apart." That evening, after Ramirez had departed with promises to return with the necessary testimony paperwork, Mason took Shadow and Ember on their usual trail walk. The forest path wound through pine and aspen, eventually cresting a small rise that offered views across the valley. At the summit, Mason paused, watching as Shadow and Ember explored the overlook with their customary energy. Ember dashing from scent to scent, Shadow monitoring both her puppy and the surroundings with the balanced awareness she had developed. Mason had erected a simple wooden marker here months ago, 2 names carved into cedar, a quiet memorial for the family he had lost. He knelt beside it, brushing pine needles from the surface with gentle fingers. "I think you would have loved them," he said quietly. "They saved me when I couldn't save myself." Shadow appeared silently at his side, her warm presence a comfort without intrusion. After a moment, she gently nudged his hand with her nose, not demanding attention, but offering connection. Mason placed his arm around her strong shoulders, drawing strength from her steady presence. "We're going to be okay," he told her. "All of us." As the sun began its descent behind distant mountains, painting the valley in hues of gold and amber, Mason stood with Shadow and Ember on either side. 3 survivors, connected by circumstance and choice, facing the path ahead together. The gift of second chances, the lessons that emerged from Shadow and Ember's journey into Mason's life, transcended the specific circumstances of their meeting. In their story lived universal truths about resilience, connection, and the healing power of purpose that applied not just to their unique bond, but to all who have faced loss and sought redemption. Shadow's unwavering determination to protect her puppy, to seek safety even when her own body failed her, spoke to the extraordinary capacity for love that exists beyond human experience. Well, her journey through the blizzard wasn't just physical courage. It represented the ultimate expression of maternal devotion, a willingness to risk everything for the next generation. In her actions lived a reminder that true strength often manifests not in dominance or power, but in the quiet, relentless commitment to safeguard those who cannot protect themselves. Ember's resilience carried its own profound message. From his first fragile moments on Mason's kitchen table to his exuberant exploration of the world beyond the cabin, his journey embodied the remarkable capacity for growth after trauma. The puppy, who had been branded as property intended for exploitation, instead became a living embodiment of joy and discovery. His transformation illustrated how the wounds of the past need not determine the possibilities of the future, that with proper care and protection, even the most vulnerable can thrive. For Mason, the arrival of Shadow and Ember forced a confrontation with his own grief and isolation. Their needs pulled him out of the paralyzing cycle of guilt and regret, creating space for purpose to take root again. In saving them, he rediscovered the essential truth that had once defined his life as a paramedic, that helping others heal can sometimes be the most powerful medicine for our own wounds. Their bond offered a profound reminder about the nature of family, that it exists not just in shared blood or species, but in the conscious choice to protect and nurture one another. In a cabin deep in the Montana wilderness, a broken man and two traumatized animals created something both fragile and unbreakable. A commitment to move forward together, to face each day's challenges as a unit rather than alone. Perhaps most importantly, their story illuminated the transformative power of second chances. Shadow's desperate gamble in approaching a stranger's cabin, Mason's decision to open the door despite his self-imposed isolation. Each small choice represented a step toward a different future than the one that seemed inevitable. Their journey reminded us that even in our darkest moments, possibility remains, that redemption often arrives in unexpected forms, requiring only our willingness to recognize and embrace it. The healing they found together wasn't instantaneous or complete. Shadow still carried the wariness of her past. Mason still visited the memorial on the hillside. Ember's brand remained visible beneath his growing coat. Yet, in acknowledging these continuing realities, they demonstrated that healing doesn't require forgetting or erasing, only learning to carry our histories with greater gentleness and purpose. Their story speaks to anyone who has ever lost their way, who has felt the world narrow to an endless winter of isolation. It whispers the truth that connection, even across boundaries of species and experience, contains the seed of renewal. That in reaching beyond our pain to help another, we often find the path back to ourselves. In the end, the bond between Mason, Shadow, and Ember offered a simple but profound affirmation. That love, expressed through protection and presence, remains our most powerful resource for transformation. Not the romantic love of poems and songs, but the steadfast commitment to stand guard over another's vulnerability, the kind of love that shows itself in midnight vigils and morning walks, in daily routines and moments of crisis, the quiet, consistent choice to be there, whatever comes. This is the gift they gave each other, and the message their story offers to us all. That second chances arrive in unexpected forms. That healing happens in community, not isolation. That purpose can find us even when we've stopped looking, and that sometimes the most broken among us, human and animal alike, can become the most powerful examples of what it means to rebuild a life with dignity, courage, and love. A bond beyond words. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the remarkable story of Shadow, Ember, and Mason. Their tale reminds us of the extraordinary connections that can form between humans and dogs. Bonds that transcend language and sometimes save us when we need it most. We'd love to hear your own experiences with the special dogs in your life. Have you ever been rescued by a four-legged friend? Has a dog ever appeared in your life exactly when you needed them most? Share your stories in the comments below. Every experience adds to our understanding of these remarkable relationships. If Shadow and Ember's story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to our channel for more tales of extraordinary animals and the humans whose lives they transform. Each subscription helps us continue sharing these powerful stories of hope, healing, and the unbreakable bonds that can form between species. Remember that somewhere right now there's a dog waiting for their second chance, perhaps at your local shelter. Sometimes the most profound relationships begin with the simple decision to open a door and let love in.